They laughed at her for buying the skinniest horse anyone had ever seen. But Nora Talbot wasn't laughing back. She stood in the dusty corral, her weathered hands gripping the lead rope of what looked like a walking skeleton, with hide stretched over bones. The animal's ribs showed through patchy fur. Its head hung low, and every step seemed like it might be its last. "You paid actual money for that bag of bones?" Sterling Maddox's voice carried across the auction yard, drawing snickers from the crowd of ranchers. His polished boots kicked up dust as he approached, flanked by his hired hands. "That thing ain't worth the rope around its neck." Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her eyes on the horse. She'd spent her last $30 on this animal, while others bid on strong, healthy stock. The auctioneer had barely been able to contain his surprise when she raised her hand for the final bid. "Ma'am, you sure about this?" Dusty Jack, the old horse trader, squinted at her purchase with genuine concern. "That animal's been through something terrible. Probably won't last the week." But there was something in the horse's eyes that spoke to her. Beneath the exhaustion and neglect, she saw intelligence, recognition. This wasn't just any broken-down animal. The way it held its head when she first approached, the careful precision of its movements despite its condition. Everything about this horse whispered of something more. "Sometimes the best things come in the worst packages," Nora said quietly. Running her hand along the horse's neck, the animal leaned into her touch, and for a moment its eyes cleared. Sterling laughed harder. "Best things? Lady, you just bought yourself a trip to the boneyard. That animal's got one foot in the grave already." "We'll see about that," Nora replied, but her voice carried uncertainty. She'd risked everything on this decision, and doubt gnawed at her stomach like hunger. Her small ranch was barely hanging on, and $30 was a fortune she couldn't afford to waste. As she led the horse toward her wagon, Whiskey Jim, the horse dealer, caught her arm. His grip was firm. "Urgent. You don't understand what you've done," he whispered, glancing around nervously. "That animal, it's not what it appears to be." "What do you mean?" Nora asked. But Jim had already released her arm and stepped back, his face pale beneath his weathered hat. "Some secrets are worth killing for," he muttered. Then louder, "Good luck with your purchase, ma'am." The crowd continued their mockery as Nora loaded the frail horse into her wagon, but she noticed something that chilled her blood. Not everyone was laughing. 3 men in dark coats stood at the edge of the crowd, watching her with intense, calculating eyes. They'd been silent throughout the auction, but now they whispered among themselves with the urgency of men who'd just watched their prey slip away. And as her wagon rolled away from the auction yard, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that buying this horse had just put her life in danger. The wagon ride back to her ranch felt longer than usual. Every few minutes, Nora glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see those 3 men in dark coats following her. The horse lay in the wagon bed, its breathing shallow but steady. She'd thrown her only good blanket over its thin frame, and already she could see it trying to lift its head with more strength. When she finally reached her small homestead, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her modest corral. Nora's hands shook as she unhitched her wagon horse and led her new purchase into the shelter of her barn. The building wasn't much, weathered wood and a leaking roof, but it would have to do. "Easy now," she whispered, settling the animal into the cleanest stall she had. As she poured water into the trough, the horse raised its head and looked directly at her. For a moment, Nora could have sworn she saw gratitude in those dark eyes. But gratitude wouldn't pay her debts. She'd gambled everything on an instinct. And now reality crashed down on her like a fallen beam. Her neighbor, Crawford, had been circling her property like a vulture, waiting for her to fail so he could buy her land for pennies. The $30 she'd spent today was supposed to go toward her overdue loan payment. She was preparing feed when she heard the soft whinny. The horse had somehow gotten to its feet and was pawing at the ground with one front hoof. Not random movements, deliberate, purposeful scratching in the dirt. Nora knelt down and brushed away the loose soil. Her breath caught in her throat. Carved into the wooden floor of the stall, barely visible under years of dirt and hay, were initials. RM 1847. "RM," she whispered, running her fingers over the carved letters. Her grandfather had told her stories about this region, about the old families who'd settled here decades ago. But before she could think further, the sound of approaching horses sent ice through her veins. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, moving slowly toward her property. Even in the fading light, she recognized the dark coats. They'd followed her after all. Nora's heart hammered as she stepped out of the barn, positioning herself between the riders and her new horse. The lead rider was a tall man with cold eyes, and a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. "Evening, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "Heard you made quite a purchase today." "Don't know what you mean," Nora replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "The horse, ma'am. That particular animal belongs to some associates of ours. There's been a misunderstanding. I bought it fair and square at auction. Got the papers to prove it." The scarred man smiled, but it held no warmth. "Papers can be problematic sometimes. We'd be willing to pay you double what you spent. Consider it a generous offer for your trouble." $60 would solve her immediate problems, but something in the man's tone told her this wasn't really an offer. It was a threat disguised as courtesy. "The horse isn't for sale," she said. The three men exchanged glances. The leader's smile faded completely. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand. That animal carries something that doesn't belong to you, something that could get you killed if you're not careful." Before Nora could respond, a shot rang out from the direction of the main road. All four of them turned toward the sound, and in that moment of distraction, Nora made a decision that would change everything. The gunshot had come from Sheriff Coleman, riding hard down the main road with a posse behind him. The three men in dark coats tensed immediately, hands moving toward their weapons. But it wasn't them the sheriff was after. He was chasing someone else entirely. "We'll be back tomorrow, ma'am," the scarred man said, pulling his reins tight. "Think carefully about our offer. Some things are worth more than money, and some things are worth dying for." They rode off into the gathering darkness, leaving Nora alone with questions that multiplied by the minute. She rushed back into the barn, where the horse had somehow managed to stand and was pawing at the ground again, this time near the back wall. Following the animal's lead, Nora pressed her hands against the weathered boards. One of them gave slightly. Behind it, wrapped in oiled leather, was a small bundle. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it, revealing a deed, an original land grant signed by the territorial governor in 1847. The name on it made her blood run cold. Robert Montgomery. Robert Montgomery, the legendary cattle baron who'd supposedly died broke and landless 30 years ago. According to this deed, he'd owned nearly 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, including the entire valley where Sterling Maddox now ran his empire. But this wasn't just any deed. Pressed into the wax seal was a distinctive mark, a crescent moon with 3 stars. The same mark she'd noticed branded faintly on her horse's shoulder, almost invisible beneath the matted hair. Nora's mind raced. If this deed was legitimate, it meant Sterling Maddox had been running cattle on stolen land for decades. It meant the entire foundation of his wealth was built on fraud. It meant this skinny, neglected horse was carrying evidence that could destroy the most powerful man in 3 counties. "That's why they want you back," she whispered to the animal. "You're not just a horse, you're a walking treasure map." But her moment of understanding was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats returning. This time, it wasn't 3 riders. It was a dozen. Through the barn window she could see torches bobbing in the darkness, moving in a wide circle around her property. Sterling Maddox's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Mrs. Talbot, we need to have a conversation about your recent purchase." Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. The deed in her hands suddenly felt heavier than iron. She had 2 choices: surrender the horse and the evidence or fight for what might be the most valuable discovery in the territory's history. The horse nudged her shoulder gently, and she looked into its eyes. This animal had carried this secret for who knows how long, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover the truth. The previous owner had trained it to reveal the hiding place only to someone who showed it kindness. "Nora," Sterling's voice was closer now, just outside the barn. "I know what you found. That deed won't hold up in any court. Too old, too convenient, but I'll give you $500 for the horse and whatever papers you think you have." $500. More money than she'd see in 5 years of struggling to keep her ranch afloat. Enough to pay off her debts and start fresh somewhere else. But as she held the deed up to the lamplight, examining the official seals and signatures, Nora realized something that changed everything. This wasn't just about money anymore. Sterling Maddox stepped into the barn with his men flanking him, their torches casting dancing shadows on the walls. Up close, Nora could see the desperation behind his confident mask. This wasn't a man making a casual offer. This was a man fighting for his survival. $500 is a generous sum," Sterling said, his eyes fixed on the deed in her hands. "More than generous for a woman in your position." "My position?" Nora asked, though she kept the document pressed against her chest. "A woman alone, struggling to pay her debts. about to lose everything. His smile was cold as winter wind. Crawford tells me you're 3 months behind on your loan payments. The bank's been patient, but patience runs thin. That's when Nora understood the full scope of what she was facing. Sterling hadn't just built his empire on stolen land. He'd been systematically destroying anyone who might threaten his claim. Crawford wasn't just a greedy neighbor, he was Sterling's agent, buying up failing properties to ensure no one could challenge the fraud. "You've been sabotaging the small ranchers," she said, the pieces falling into place, "making sure we fail, buying up our land through Crawford." "Business is business," Sterling replied, "but I'm offering you a way out. Take the money, leave the territory, start fresh somewhere else." Behind him, one of his men shifted nervously. "Boss, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Hayes," Sterling snapped, then turned back to Nora with forced calm. "The deed you're holding is worthless. Robert Montgomery died broke. Even if that document was real, which it isn't, you'd need Montgomery's will to prove inheritance, and that will was burned in a courthouse fire 20 years ago." But the horse behind Nora whinnied softly and pawed the ground again, this time near a different section of the stall. Following its lead, she found another loose board. Behind it was a second bundle, smaller than the first. Robert Montgomery's last will and testament, dated 3 days before his supposed death, leaving everything to his daughter, Margaret Montgomery, who had married a rancher named Talbot in 1852, Nora's grandfather, which meant she wasn't just holding evidence of fraud. She was holding proof of her own inheritance to the largest ranch in 3 counties. Sterling's face went pale as understanding dawned. "That's impossible. Margaret Montgomery died childless. She had a son," Nora said quietly. "My father, which makes me the rightful heir to every acre you've been calling yours for 30 years. The silence in the barn was deafening. Sterling's men looked between their boss and this woman, who'd just claimed ownership of their entire world. One of them actually took a step backward. "Even if that's true," Sterling said, his voice dangerously low, "you'll never live to see a courtroom. Accidents happen to people who get too ambitious." That's when Nora heard it, the sound that would save her life. Hoofbeats approaching fast, but from the wrong direction. Not more of Sterling's men, but riders coming from town. The sheriff's voice carried across the night. "Sterling Maddox, by order of the territorial court, you're under arrest for land fraud and intimidation." Sheriff Coleman had been investigating Sterling for months, waiting for evidence. The gunshot earlier hadn't been random. It had been Coleman arresting one of Sterling's associates who'd finally agreed to testify. But Sterling wasn't finished. As his men began to scatter, he pulled a gun and pointed it directly at the horse. "If I can't have it, nobody can," he snarled. "That animal dies here tonight." The horse that had survived neglect, abuse, and years of carrying deadly secrets was about to die for what it knew. Unless Nora could do something she'd never done before in her life. She had exactly 3 seconds to make a choice that would determine whether she became the richest woman in the territory or lost everything to a madman's revenge. Nora threw herself between Sterling's gun and the horse, just as Sheriff Coleman burst through the barn door with 3 deputies. The standoff lasted only seconds, but they felt like hours. Sterling's finger tightened on the trigger, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man watching his empire crumble. "Drop the weapon, Sterling!" Coleman shouted, his own gun drawn. "It's over!" But Sterling's attention was locked on Nora. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed. "That land has been in my family's care for 30 years. I built something from nothing." "You built something from lies," Nora replied, holding the documents tight against her chest. "And it was never yours to build on." The horse behind her snorted softly, as if sensing the tension. Despite its weakened condition, it had somehow found the strength to stand, positioning itself protectively behind Nora. This animal understood more than anyone realized. Sterling's hand shook as he kept the gun trained on them both. "Those papers won't hold up. I'll fight this in every court from here to Washington. I'll bury you in legal fees until you're begging to sell." "Actually, you won't," Sheriff Coleman said, stepping closer. "We found your correspondence with Crawford, your orders to sabotage water rights, your payments to drive small ranchers off their land. The territorial judge issued a warrant for your arrest 2 hours ago." That's when Sterling made his final, desperate gamble. Instead of surrendering, he spun toward the barn's back wall and fired 3 shots into the wooden boards where the documents had been hidden. Splinters exploded in all directions as he tried to destroy any evidence that might remain. But his shots revealed something none of them had expected. Behind the shattered boards was a cavity that held more than just documents. Dozens of them. Deeds, contracts, bills of sale, correspondence. 30 years of evidence showing how Sterling had systematically stolen land from families across 3 counties. Robert Montgomery was smarter than anyone knew, Nora whispered, understanding flooding through her. He didn't just hide his own deed. He gathered evidence of every fraudulent land grab in the territory. The horse had been carrying the location of the most comprehensive collection of territorial land fraud evidence ever assembled. Montgomery had spent his final years collecting proof, knowing that someday, someone would need it to set things right. Sterling's face went ashen as he saw the scope of what had been hidden. This wasn't just about his ranch anymore. This was evidence that could overturn dozens of land claims, affect hundreds of families, and reshape the entire territorial power structure. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "If those documents surface, it won't just destroy me. Half the territorial government is involved. They'll kill us all, rather than let this see daylight." Sheriff Coleman handcuffed Sterling while his deputies secured the scene. But Nora could see the worry in the sheriff's eyes. Sterling wasn't exaggerating. The corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined. As they led Sterling away, he turned back to Nora with a final warning. "You think you won something here tonight? You just painted a target on your back that reaches all the way to the territorial capital. Those men won't stop coming." Alone in the barn with the horse and mountains of evidence, Nora realized her problems were just beginning. She wasn't just the rightful heir to a massive ranch anymore. She was now the most dangerous woman in the territory, holding secrets that could topple the entire power structure. And somewhere in the darkness, more riders were already planning their next move. The next morning brought visitors that confirmed Sterling's warning. Judge Harrison arrived with 2 territorial officials and a small army of armed men. But unlike Sterling's intimidation tactics, this was legal pressure wrapped in official authority. "Mrs. Talbot," Judge Harrison said, removing his hat as he entered her modest home, "I understand you've come into possession of certain historical documents." Nora had spent the sleepless night studying the papers by lamplight. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Land grants forged, surveys falsified, entire families driven from their legitimate claims. The horse had been carrying evidence that could invalidate half the property ownership in 3 counties. "Historical documents that prove fraud," she corrected. "Fraud that goes right to the top of the territorial government." The judge's expression remained neutral, but she caught the nervous glance he exchanged with his companions. "These are serious accusations. Of course, such old papers would need extensive authentication. The process could take years, expensive years." The threat was clear, but politely delivered. They would tie her up in legal proceedings until she was bankrupt and broken. But Nora had discovered something during her night of reading that changed everything. "According to territorial law," she said, opening one of Montgomery's carefully preserved legal books, "when fraud is proven in land acquisition, the original grant supersedes all subsequent claims immediately. No lengthy court process required." "That's a very old statute," one of the officials said quickly. "Likely superseded by newer legislation." "Actually, it was reinforced just last year," Sheriff Coleman said from the doorway. He'd been standing guard outside, listening. "Ironically, by legislation that Judge Harrison himself supported to prevent exactly this kind of fraud." The room fell silent. Judge Harrison's face flushed red as he realized his own legal reforms had just trapped him, but their visit revealed something else troubling. Through the window, Nora could see more riders approaching. Not officials this time, but the kind of hard men who settle disputes with bullets rather than legal papers. "Mrs. Talbot," the judge said quietly, "I strongly advise you to reconsider your position. Some people have invested too much in the current situation to let it change peacefully." That's when the horse in the barn began making noise. Not distressed whinnying, but the rhythmic pawing that had revealed the hidden documents. Despite its weakened condition, it was trying to tell her something urgent. "Excuse me," Nora said, stepping toward the door. "I need to check on my animal." In the barn, she found the horse pawing near yet another section of the stall. This time, the loose board revealed something that made her blood run cold. A detailed map showing every water source, every hidden trail, every defensible position in the valley. Montgomery hadn't just been collecting evidence of fraud, he'd been preparing for war. Written in his careful handwriting across the bottom of the map were the words, "When they come for you, remember, the High Canyon has only one way in, but 3 ways out." The sound of gunshots from the direction of her house sent ice through her veins. The legal pressure had just turned deadly, and she was trapped in a barn with a half-dead horse and evidence that powerful men would kill to possess. But the horse was struggling to its feet again, moving toward the back of the barn with purpose. It knew something she didn't. Another way out that Montgomery had prepared for exactly this situation. As the gunfire intensified and voices shouted orders outside, Nora realized she had to make an impossible choice. Abandon everything and run with the horse, or stay and fight for what was rightfully hers. The decision would determine not just her survival, but the future of every honest family in the territory. The horse led Nora to a hidden panel in the barn's back wall that opened onto a narrow trail leading up into the canyon walls. Montgomery had planned for this exact scenario 30 years ago, creating an escape route that only his trained horse would know. Despite its weakened condition, the animal moved with surprising determination, as if understanding that both their lives depended on reaching safety. Behind them, the gunfire had stopped, replaced by angry voices and the sound of men searching the barn. "The papers are gone!" someone shouted. "Find the woman!" Nora clutched the most crucial documents against her chest as they climbed the rocky path. The horse moved slowly but steadily, following a route it had probably traveled countless times with its original owner. Every few hundred yards, the animal would pause and look back, as if checking that she was still following. The trail wound higher into the canyon, exactly as Montgomery's map had indicated. As they reached the first waypoint, Nora could see the tactical genius of the route. Anyone following them would be exposed on the open trail below, while she and the horse would have cover among the rocks above. 3 hours into their climb, they reached Montgomery's hidden camp, a natural cave stocked with supplies that had been carefully maintained for decades. Someone had been keeping this refuge ready, probably the same person who had cared for the horse all these years. Inside the cave, Nora found more than just supplies. Montgomery had left detailed instructions for what to do with the evidence, including the names of honest officials in the territorial capital who could be trusted. But more importantly, she found correspondence that revealed the identity of Montgomery's secret ally, Judge Harrison's own deputy clerk, a man named Thomas Briggs who had been secretly working to expose the corruption for 20 years. As she studied the documents by firelight, the horse whinnied softly and moved to the cave entrance. Down in the valley, she could see torches spreading out in a search pattern. They had dozens of men looking for her, but they were searching in the wrong places. That's when she heard the sound that changed everything. A single gunshot, followed by shouting. Not the angry voices of searchers, but the authoritative commands of federal marshals. Thomas Briggs had finally made his move, using Nora's discovery as the catalyst to spring a trap that had been 20 years in the making. Through Montgomery's carefully hidden telescope, she watched as federal agents arrested Judge Harrison, 3 territorial officials, and over a dozen of their hired gunmen. The corruption network that had seemed so powerful just hours ago was collapsing like a house built on sand. But the horse was pawing the ground again, this time near a final cache of documents. Montgomery's last message was brief, but clear. "The evidence you carry proves ownership of all disputed lands. Present it to Federal Marshal Connor at sunrise on the courthouse steps. He will be waiting." Nora looked down at the skinny horse that had carried 30 years of secrets, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover the truth. In 3 days, this animal had transformed her from a struggling rancher facing foreclosure into the rightful owner of the largest legitimate land claim in the territory. But first, they had to survive the night and make it to town by sunrise. At sunrise, Nora rode the skeletal horse down Main Street toward the courthouse, carrying 30 years of carefully preserved evidence. Federal Marshal Connor was waiting exactly as Montgomery had promised, flanked by territorial surveyors and legal officials who had traveled overnight from the capital. "Mrs. Talbot," Marshal Connor said, tipping his hat. "Thomas Briggs tells me you have something that belongs to the people of this territory." Nora dismounted and handed over the documents that proved her inheritance and exposed the massive fraud. As the marshal examined each paper, his expression grew more serious. "This is the most comprehensive evidence of territorial land fraud we've ever seen. These documents invalidate dozens of illegitimate claims and restore ownership to the rightful heirs." Within hours, the legal machinery was in motion. The territorial surveyor confirmed that Nora's inheritance included not just Sterling Maddox's stolen ranch, but over 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, 3 towns, 2 silver mining claims, and water rights to the entire valley system. Robert Montgomery had been far wealthier than anyone realized, and his carefully documented evidence proved every acre belonged to his descendants. According to territorial law and these verified documents, Marshal Connor announced publicly, Mrs. Nora Talbot is the legitimate heir to the Montgomery estate, valued at approximately $1.2 million. The crowd that had gathered fell silent. The woman they had mocked for buying a dying horse 3 days ago was now the wealthiest landowner in 3 counties. Sterling Maddox, watching from his jail cell window, could only stare as his entire empire legally transferred to the woman he had tried to intimidate. Judge Harrison and his corrupt officials faced federal charges that would keep them in prison for decades. But Nora's first priority wasn't her newfound wealth. She led the horse to the town's best veterinarian, sparing no expense for its care. This animal saved not just my life, but the lives of every honest family in this territory, she told Dr. Whitman. Whatever it costs, make it strong again. Under proper care and feeding, the horse began to recover with remarkable speed. Its intelligence and training became obvious as its health improved. Montgomery had bred and trained this animal specifically to be the guardian of his legacy, and it had fulfilled that purpose perfectly. 6 months later, Nora stood on the porch of the magnificent ranch house that was now rightfully hers, watching her recovered horse gallop across meadows that stretched beyond the horizon. The animal that everyone had considered worthless was now the pampered favorite of the largest ranch in the territory. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive. Every family that Sterling had cheated received their land back. Crawford lost everything and fled the territory. The corruption network that had controlled the region for 30 years was completely dismantled. Nora had kept her promise to care for the horse that changed her destiny, building it the finest stable in the territory. She had also established a fund to help other struggling ranchers, remembering what it felt like to face foreclosure and mockery. The woman who had gambled her last $30 on a skeletal horse was now worth over $1 million. But more importantly, she had restored justice to hundreds of families. Sometimes the best things really do come in the worst packages, and sometimes having faith in what others can't see is the greatest investment of all. The horse that carried the secret lived out its days in comfort, having finally completed the mission Robert Montgomery had trained it for 30 years earlier. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.
A police officer was driving through a raging snowstorm when he suddenly heard the faint cries of a dog. Following the sound, he found a pregnant German shepherd curled up and whimpering against a tree, her body trembling, her eyes begging for help. She was tied, abandoned, and close to giving birth. But what happened next would not only save her life, it would uncover a secret so powerful it brought an entire town together. What came after will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe every animal deserves love and not loneliness, hit subscribe, because this story might just change the way you see the world. Blue Ridge, Colorado, winter. 2:17 a.m. The wind howled like a wounded animal, flinging snow sideways across the narrow mountain road. Visibility was down to inches. Officer Daniel Cross squinted through the windshield of his cruiser, wipers scraping in vain against the freezing sleet. The night was a white void, unrelenting, suffocating, alive with cold. Daniel, 36, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a lean, athletic build worn down by sleepless nights. His brown hair, trimmed short under regulation code, had started showing early threads of gray at the temples, scars not of age, but of memory. His gray eyes were sharp but weary, the kind forged through years of seeing more pain than justice. Once hopeful, he had now become a man who spoke only when necessary, who carried silence like armor. Ever since his wife had passed away in a hit-and-run 3 winters ago, her case still unsolved, he had avoided the warmth of connection, choosing instead the company of snow, sirens, and duty. His cruiser rattled as he turned onto the Blue Ridge Pass, a steep, twisting route that snaked along the edge of a cliff overlooking pine-covered valleys. It was technically closed tonight due to the storm, but a tip about suspicious tire tracks earlier that day had stuck in his mind. Something felt off, and then he heard it. A sound beneath the wind. Not the cry of a fox or the screech of tree limbs bowing under ice. This was softer, pained. He slowed the cruiser, rolled down the window a crack. The cold sliced in like a knife. There it was again, a low, aching whimper. He pulled over to the shoulder and stepped out, boots crunching against the thick snowpack. His flashlight cut a narrow tunnel of light through the blizzard. There, curled beside the base of a twisted pine tree, half buried in snow, was a German shepherd. Her coat, once likely a proud sable in black, was now matted with ice and dirt. She was clearly pregnant. Her belly swollen, sides trembling with each breath. One hind leg was bloodied and stiff. Around her neck, a thick rope had been chewed through, still trailing down her side like a noose cut short. Daniel crouched, his voice low. "Hey, girl, you're not supposed to be here." The dog lifted her head just slightly. Brown eyes met gray, not wild, not frightened, just tired and pleading. She didn't move, didn't growl, didn't even flinch when he pulled his blanket from the cruiser and gently draped it over her. "You've been through hell," he muttered. "Haven't you?" The snow stung his face. The wind was rising. If he left her here, she wouldn't survive the hour. Daniel glanced at the curve of the road. No other vehicle tracks, no houses for miles. "This wasn't an accident," he whispered. He scooped her up, gently, cradling her like a child. She was lighter than she should have been, bones too sharp under fur. She didn't resist, just let her head fall against his shoulder, eyes drifting closed. Daniel laid her in the back seat, heater blasting. She gave a soft, raspy sigh. He reached for the radio. Static, of course. The storm had knocked out reception. He started the cruiser, wheels spinning briefly before catching traction, and headed back down the mountain, toward the station, toward shelter. At the Blue Ridge Police substation, the windows flickered with emergency lights, but the building inside was dark. Backup generators hadn't kicked in. Inside, Deputy Claire Morgan stood near the operations board with a flashlight balanced on her shoulder. At 27, Claire was smart, stubborn, and still green enough to think the system could be saved. Her auburn hair was tied in a tight bun under her patrol cap, and her uniform sleeves were rolled halfway to her elbows, revealing small scratches, probably from trying to fix the damn fuse box again. Claire was petite but carried herself like she was 10 feet tall. Her voice could cut through any room. Raised by a single father who was a retired ranger, she'd grown up tracking elk and fixing carburetors. But she hated storms. Not the cold, the silence. Too many things could hide inside silence. She jumped when the station door slammed open, letting in a gust of snow and the figure of Daniel, hunched and holding something wrapped in a wool blanket. "Jesus, what the hell?" Claire rushed forward, lowering the flashlight. "A dog," Daniel said, breathing hard. "Pregnant. Bleeding. Left out there to die." Claire pulled the door shut behind them and helped him lay the dog onto a pile of spare blankets near the heater vent. "Storm's getting worse," she muttered. "Power's not coming back soon." "She's not just any stray," Daniel said. "There was a rope, chewed through, like she escaped." Claire paused. "You think it was abuse? Fights?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He watched as the dog, now resting on her side, let out a weak, tremoring breath. Then he said, "No. I think she was running from something." Later that night, as the wind battered the windows and the generator coughed once again into failure, Daniel sat cross-legged beside the dog, flashlight between his knees. He gently cleaned the wound on her leg with warm water and antiseptic. She flinched once, then relaxed. He could feel her ribs under his hands. Too sharp, too frail. "Hope," he said softly. Claire looked up from across the room. "Huh? I think I'll call her Hope." Claire smiled faintly. "Fitting." Daniel leaned back against the wall watching her. The storm howled louder outside. He didn't know yet, but Hope wasn't just a dog left behind. She was the first thread in a knot of secrets still buried in the mountains. And tonight, with a storm clawing at the town and the power flickering like a dying breath, Hope had chosen him. The storm had not yet passed when Daniel turned off the main road and pulled into his gravel driveway. His cabin sat near the edge of Pine Hollow, nestled between evergreens crusted with snow. The house was modest, a single story with faded cedar siding and a tin roof that popped under the weight of falling ice. Lights flickered in the window, running on the backup generator he'd wired himself. It wasn't much, but it was his, the one thing that had felt like home since Emily died. In the back seat, the German Shepherd, now named Hope, stirred faintly beneath the layers of blankets. She hadn't made a sound since leaving the station, save for the occasional twitch of her ears or a weak shudder. Daniel had barely spoken either. The storm outside was quieter than the one still churning inside him. He carried her in carefully, easing open the front door with his foot and stepping into the warmth. The scent of pine wood and old books filled the air. A faded photo of Emily still hung above the fireplace, her smile forever frozen at the edge of memory. Daniel laid Hope on a thick towel beside the hearth where the fire crackled softly. Her eyes fluttered open and fixed on him, just for a second, then closed again. Her breathing was shallow. He picked up his phone, dialed a number he hadn't used in over a year. "Dr. Jennings?" came the groggy voice on the other end. "It's Cross," Daniel said. "I need you to come out. It's urgent." There was a pause. "Daniel, you okay?" "It's not for me. It's a dog. German Shepherd. Pregnant. Bad shape." Another pause, then a sigh. "I'll be there in 20. Dr. Ellen Jennings arrived 23 minutes later, wrapped in a long wool coat and red scarf that clashed with her worn vet bag. She was in her late 40s, with thick black glasses and a sharp, dry wit that often masked a deeply empathetic heart. The kind of woman who once ran an animal shelter single-handedly after a flood wiped out half the county's kennels. She knelt by the dog without a word, brushing snow from her fur and pressing her fingers along the belly. Her brow creased. "She's carrying," she murmured. "At least 5 pups, maybe 6. "Can she make it?" Daniel asked, leaning on the doorway. "She's underweight, dehydrated. One leg is partially infected, and her pulse is slow." Ellen looked up. If she was left out much longer, she wouldn't have. "Can you help her?" "I'll do what I can." Ellen opened her bag and got to work. Fluids, antibiotics, warm compresses. Daniel helped where he could, holding Hope still as the needle went in, brushing her ears when she flinched. It took over an hour, but eventually Hope's breathing began to steady. "She's not out of the woods," Ellen said finally, wiping her hands. "But you brought her in just in time." Daniel sat back, exhausted. "She's got a name now. Hope." Ellen gave a tired smile. "Fitting." She glanced around the cabin, taking in the quiet, the faint scent of cedar, the folded quilt still on the couch. "You've been alone too long, Daniel." He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to Hope. "She showed up for a reason. I don't think it's random." Ellen hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Some dogs, they find who they're meant to find, especially the broken ones." Before she left, Ellen handed him a small kit with instructions. "Call me if anything changes, and keep her warm." The storm had eased by morning. Snow still blanketed the mountains, but the wind had fallen silent, and the world outside looked softer, less threatening. Inside, Hope hadn't moved, but her breathing was steady now. Her ears occasionally flicked at the crackle of the fire. Daniel sat nearby, reading a worn copy of Old Yeller, not for entertainment, just to keep his mind still. A knock sounded on the door. Daniel opened it to find Mr. Walter Whitaker, his neighbor from 3 houses down, standing in a thick canvas jacket and trapper hat dusted with snow. Whitaker was in his early 70s, wiry and stooped, with the kind of wiry mustache that curled at the edges. A former electrician and volunteer firefighter, he was the sort who grumbled at everything but showed up exactly when needed. "You know your front generator's blinking red?" he said without greeting. Daniel blinked. "Didn't notice." "Course you didn't. You got a dog in there." Whitaker stepped past him without waiting and made straight for the side panel outside. "Heard you were out late last night. Folks at the diner said you were seen up near the pass." "There was a dog," Daniel said, following. "Pregnant. Hurt. I brought her back," Whitaker grunted. "Seems like that's the third one in 2 weeks. Saw another mutt limping around the tracks near Carson Trail. And Shelley behind the market said she found a collar buried behind her shed." Daniel stopped. "You're saying dogs are being dumped?" "Seems like more than coincidence," Whitaker muttered, squinting at the panel. "Got a flashlight?" He handed one over, and for the next 20 minutes the two men worked to reset the generator connection. It was small talk at first, snow loads, old fuse tricks, but Whitaker's voice lowered when he asked, "You think someone's doing it on purpose?" Daniel didn't answer right away, then, "I think Hope was running from something, and she led me back." Whitaker gave him a look, not skeptical, not mocking, just quiet understanding. Then maybe it's time someone started asking the right questions. By sunset, the cabin was quiet again. Daniel set out fresh water for Hope and crushed pills into soft food, placing the bowl beside her. She sniffed it weakly, then took a bite. It wasn't much, but it was the first step. He sat beside her again, hand resting lightly on her flank. "You made it here for a reason," he whispered. Hope lifted her head just slightly. Her nose nudged against his wrist, and Daniel, for the first time in months, smiled. Just a little. By the third morning, the snow had hardened into a brittle crust along the shoulders of Blue Ridge Pass. Ice clung to tree branches like crystal veins, and the sharp wind had quieted into silence, a silence that felt too deliberate, too aware. Daniel packed his thermos, pulled on his service boots, and gently scratched behind Hope's ears before stepping out. She was stronger now, eyes alert but cautious, and had even begun to shift her weight and sit up unassisted. He hated leaving her, even for a short while, but something had lodged in his chest since she arrived. A thread left untugged. It was time to return to where it all began. Daniel's cruiser hummed along the icy road, tires crunching against frostbitten gravel. He drove slowly, eyes sweeping the curves of the pass where he had first seen Hope. At a bend just before the ridge's crest, he stopped the engine. The memory returned instantly. The huddled shape in the snow, the blood speckling the white, the wind wailing like a wounded thing. He stepped out, flashlight in hand, boots sinking into the snowpack. At first, it looked like nothing, just a stretch of empty road. But 10 paces in, past the shoulder and down a short slope, he spotted the first clue. Tire tracks. Not from a sedan or SUV. These were deeper, wider, with a distinct dual tread pattern that screamed cargo truck. Daniel crouched, brushing snow from the frozen mud beneath. The tracks turned into a clearing, where the underbrush had been trampled. Then he saw it. A metal cage, half buried in snow, its door torn at the hinges. Bits of fur still clung to the wire mesh. The smell of rust and something darker clung to the air. Daniel's jaw tightened. This wasn't a random abandonment. This was organized. He took photos, documented what he could. He was about to head back when he heard it, a low, deliberate bark echoing faintly in the stillness. Hope. She had followed him. Daniel turned to see her at the crest of the hill, limping but determined, nose low to the ground. Her sable coat shimmered faintly under the pale sun, the silver streaks along her back like scars of smoke. She stopped near the cage, sniffed intently, and then barked once more, turning toward the thick tree line to the west. Her eyes locked onto his, insistent. "You smell something," Daniel murmured. Hope barked again and pawed at the snow, her body tense, alert. He didn't press further. She'd done enough for today. He lifted her carefully into the truck bed, wrapped her in a blanket, and drove them both home. That afternoon, he brought his findings to the station. Inside the Blue Ridge Sheriff's Department, the atmosphere was tense. Power had returned to most of the town, but morale lagged behind. Paperwork was backed up. Phones rang without answers. And in the middle of the bullpen sat Deputy Claire Morgan, scrolling through missing animal reports with a highlighter in one hand and a cold cup of coffee in the other. Claire was 27, sharp-eyed, with a wiry, athletic frame and a ponytail of chestnut hair that always slipped loose by noon. She was known for being both relentlessly curious and stubborn to the point of irritating her superiors, but Daniel trusted her judgment more than most. She'd grown up in Blue Ridge and had joined the force after an injury ended her soccer scholarship at Colorado State. That loss made her fight even harder, for animals, for kids, for people no one else noticed. Daniel dropped a photo of the cage on her desk. Claire looked up. "That from where you found her?" He nodded. "Big rig tires, cage discarded. She wasn't alone." Claire frowned, then reached beneath the stack of reports and pulled out a file marked in red. "You might want to see this. I ran a pattern this morning. There's been an uptick in calls about missing dogs, mostly large breeds, shepherds, Rottweilers, even a couple of mixed mutts, all in the past 2 months, all from areas near highway access." Daniel leafed through the pages. It wasn't just coincidence. These weren't pets running off. They were being taken, and the pattern hinted at trafficking. "Any leads?" he asked. "Nothing solid. A few witnesses mentioned seeing a white van. No plates. One said it was parked near the old quarry trailhead last week, but by the time I got there it was gone." Daniel exhaled slowly. "You think it's a ring?" Claire nodded grimly. "It's too organized to be anything else. Rumor says some of these dogs end up in illegal fights. Others are sold for testing." The mention hit Daniel like a punch to the ribs. He turned away, gripping the edge of the filing cabinet. A flash of memory surged. His wife Emily, bright-eyed and stubborn, brushing hair from her forehead as she cradled a rescued greyhound in her arms. She had spent her life as a veterinary advocate, fighting illegal breeding, pushing for tougher regulations. She had died in a highway crash 2 winters ago, on her way home from a rural clinic where she'd just helped shut down an unlicensed lab. Now this. Back at the cabin that evening, Daniel built the fire higher and laid a hand gently over Hope's flank. She looked at him, and in her gaze was no fear, only trust. "You didn't just survive," he whispered. "You came back to lead me." Hope licked his fingers, then pressed her head against his chest. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, revealing muddy tracks and frozen grass. But in Daniel's heart, something else was thawing. The sense that perhaps he wasn't just fighting for justice. He was finishing what Emily had started. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape cloaked in hush. The snow, once windswept and savage, now lay blanketed across Blue Ridge like a sleeping beast, undisturbed and glittering beneath the pale light of a waning moon. At the edge of town, in the small timber cabin nestled near the tree line, Daniel Cross sat quietly on the floor beside Hope's bed. Hope's breathing had changed, no longer shallow from pain, but strained with purpose. Her eyes, golden and wide, darted to Daniel's face, then back to her belly, swollen and trembling with life. He leaned closer and whispered, "I'm here. We're going to get through this, girl." He had made the space as warm as possible. Old quilts covered the floor. A portable heater hummed in the corner. Next to him, Deputy Claire Morgan had her sleeves rolled up, a towel in one hand, a flashlight in the other. She'd come after her shift, saying simply, "Didn't think you should do this alone." Hope grunted, then let out a soft, low whine. Her back legs kicked. The first pup was coming. Claire, usually composed, looked visibly shaken. "She's so calm. I don't know how." "She's stronger than most people I know," Daniel said. The birth was a slow, sacred thing. One by one, the pups emerged, wet, wriggling, blind. Daniel placed them gently beside Hope, who licked each one with deliberate care. Her body shook with exhaustion, but her eyes never wavered. She knew what to do. Even in pain, even half-healed from her wounds, Hope protected and nourished. 5 lives brought into the world in the dead of night, surrounded by pine-scented silence and a man who hadn't smiled in years now weeping quietly. They didn't speak for a long time after. Claire, seated beside the fire, cradled a pup in her palm, astonished by its size and warmth. Daniel simply watched Hope, who had curled herself around the puppies like a fortress of fur and breath. And then, A sound. A low growl. Hope stiffened, her ears perking despite her fatigue. Her nose twitched. She growled again, deeper this time, and turned her head toward the window. Daniel and Claire followed her gaze. Nothing. But Hope wouldn't settle. Then Daniel heard it, the faint crunch of snow underfoot. He stood up silently and moved toward the window, flicking off the porch light as he passed. His breath fogged the cold glass. At first he saw only trees, but then a shadow. It moved, then stopped. Human height. Watching. Daniel's hand slid instinctively to the grip of the pistol at his belt. Claire joined him, her voice low. "You see it?" He nodded. "Not clearly, but it's there." He opened the door and stepped outside. The cold sliced into him like a knife, but he kept moving. Snow muffled his boots. The yard stretched toward the woods, and in the half-light he saw faint impressions in the snow. Fresh prints, leading from the tree line to the cabin, then curving back. No vehicle. Whoever it was had come on foot. "Coward," Daniel muttered. He knew this kind of stalking wasn't random. It meant someone was keeping tabs, watching not just him, but Hope. Back inside, Hope was still growling, her body tense but curled protectively around her pups. Daniel knelt beside her and whispered reassurance. It took minutes for her breathing to ease. Later, as he poured coffee into mismatched mugs, there was a soft knock at the back door. It was Mr. Whitaker, Daniel's elderly neighbor, bundled in a wool coat and carrying a lantern. "Sorry to bother you this late, son," he said, voice roughened by age and smoke, "but I heard something out by the fence line. Figured I'd check on you." Daniel waved him inside. Mr. Whitaker was wiry and short, with a thick gray beard and a permanent squint that made him look perpetually suspicious of the world. He lived alone in a cabin 2 properties over and had once worked as a logger before his knees gave out. Despite his bluntness, he'd always had a soft spot for dogs and Daniel. The old man glanced at Hope and her pups, then gave a low whistle. "Well, I'll be—" "She made it." "She did," Daniel said, "but someone was outside earlier." Whitaker nodded slowly. "Saw a truck last night. Big one, didn't recognize it. No lights, no plates. Parked off the service road near the old ranger station. Stayed there for about 10 minutes, then backed out and drove off." Claire straightened. "You didn't get a look at the driver?" "Too far, but I don't like how quiet they were." Daniel's jaw tightened. The pieces were coming together too fast. The cage, the missing dogs, Hope's escape. And now someone circling back. For her? Or for the evidence she might represent? He looked down at the puppies, all now asleep in a tight pile against their mother's belly. Hope opened her eyes and looked straight at him. She had survived abandonment, injury, and freezing cold to bring these lives into the world. And she was warning him. They weren't safe yet. The next morning broke gray and cold, the mountains cloaked in mist, the sun little more than a pale suggestion behind the clouds. Daniel stood by the porch, sipping lukewarm coffee from a tin mug, eyes scanning the tree line beyond his snow-laced fence. Hope lay nearby on a flannel blanket, her pups nestled against her belly, but she was restless, ears twitching, eyes fixed toward the north. She was listening for something, or remembering. Daniel noticed it immediately. A tension in her muscles, a low whimper every few minutes, the way her eyes kept flicking toward the woods. Something wasn't right. He bent down, scratching behind her ear. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" Hope stood. Slowly, stiffly, still recovering from labor, she nudged Daniel's leg with her nose and gave a soft bark. Then she limped toward the steps, pausing only to look back at him. He didn't question her instinct. Within 15 minutes, Daniel had secured the pups in a warm carrier box inside the cabin, radioed Claire for backup, and followed Hope in his truck. She sat in the passenger seat, panting quietly, alert, her nose pressed to the cracked-open window. They drove past the ranger station, through old mining trails, and toward the edge of Blue Ridge's industrial zone, a cluster of rusted buildings long since abandoned. The trail ended at an old access road hidden behind a tangle of birch trees. Daniel stopped the truck and stepped out. Hope jumped down, landed unsteadily, and padded ahead. Her nose to the snow, she led Daniel to a warehouse tucked behind a fallen billboard that once advertised tractor parts. Its windows were boarded up. One side door had fresh boot prints in the snow. Daniel crouched beside them. The prints were large, deep. Someone had come here recently. He moved carefully, drawing his flashlight and pushing the side door open with a creak. The smell hit him first. Sour, metallic, and foul. He stepped inside and froze. The interior was dimly lit by cracks in the roof. Wire cages lined the walls. Inside, at least 20 dogs lay silently, some too weak to lift their heads. German shepherds, pit bulls, even a few golden retrievers, all emaciated. Some had wounds crusted with dried blood. A few whined softly, tails wagging at the sight of a human face. Daniel swallowed hard. His jaw clenched. Hope followed behind, but the moment she stepped inside, her body stiffened. Her ears perked. She sniffed the air and darted toward the far end of the warehouse, to a rusted crate half hidden beneath a tarp. Daniel followed, heart thudding. Hope let out a sharp bark and began pawing at the cage. Inside, curled in a corner, was a small pup. German shepherd markings barely weaned. Its left leg was bandaged clumsily, its ribs visible. It lifted its head and whimpered. Daniel dropped to his knees. Hope pressed her nose through the bars, whining softly. Daniel understood instantly. "This one's yours, isn't it?" He gently opened the latch and lifted the pup out. Hope began licking it immediately, whining and wagging her tail despite her weakness. The pup nestled against her chest. The moment was broken by a sudden noise, the distant rumble of a car engine. Daniel moved quickly, tucking the pup into his coat and pulling Hope behind a stack of wooden pallets. From the corner of his eye, he saw a white van pull up outside. 2 men exited, both heavy-set, both in stained overalls. One lit a cigarette while the other opened the rear doors. They entered the warehouse and began checking the cages. Daniel slid out his phone and hit record, keeping the lens angled just enough to capture their faces and actions. "You think the cops are onto us yet?" one man grunted. "Nah," said the other. "We moved the last shipment already. This dump's just the overflow. Another week and we torch it." Daniel's pulse quickened. They weren't just criminals. They were erasing evidence, and they'd already trafficked dogs elsewhere. He waited until they returned to the van before slipping outside, circling the warehouse's opposite side to his truck. Hope followed, the pup still bundled in his coat. Daniel drove away in silence, staying off the main roads until they reached a safer zone near the old grain silo. He dialed Claire immediately. She answered on the first ring. "Daniel, you okay?" "I found them," he said. "Cages, dozens of dogs, injured, malnourished. I've got one of the pups, Hope's, I'm sure of it." "Jesus," Claire whispered. "You have any video?" "Got their faces, and a confession." There was a pause. "You need to call in the feds." Daniel hesitated. "You sure?" Claire's voice firmed. "This is bigger than us, Daniel. We can't dismantle this alone. If they're moving animals out of state, it's federal. Call the FBI." He hung up, stared at the mountains in the distance, then opened the passenger door. Hope and her pup were curled together on the seat, breathing slow and steady. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "FBI Denver Field Office," came the voice on the line. Daniel took a deep breath. "My name is Officer Daniel Cross. I have evidence of an interstate animal trafficking operation operating out of Blue Ridge. I need assistance, and I've got one hell of a witness, with 4 legs." The air was thinner that morning as Daniel took the mountain road in his truck, winding higher into the Blue Ridge Pass. Snow from last week's storm had turned to gray slush near the base but still clung in patches along the ridges. The clouds overhead were slate-colored, heavy with more to come, and the wind carried the bite of something ominous. Hope sat in the back seat, unusually alert, eyes scanning the tree line like a sentinel. They were on their way to meet a contact from the Denver FBI office, but Daniel chose a more remote path, wanting to keep his vehicle unseen for a while. He wasn't paranoid, at least he didn't think he was, but something had shifted ever since he'd discovered that warehouse. The 2 men he filmed were still out there, and if they knew he had footage... As the truck rounded a bend near a crumbling guardrail, Hope stiffened and gave a low growl. "What is it, girl?" Daniel murmured, slowing the truck. The road ahead looked clear. Then everything exploded in a blur. A pickup truck barreled from a hidden trail on the left, its front grille slamming into the side of Daniel's truck. Metal screamed. Daniel's head snapped sideways, vision flashing white. The force pushed his vehicle against the embankment, one tire lifting off the ground. He groaned and reached for his sidearm just as the door was yanked open. A man loomed over him, masked in a black ski mask, muscular arms clad in a torn brown jacket. He wasn't yelling, he was silent, focused, efficient. He swung a crowbar down toward Daniel's face. Daniel rolled just in time. The blow caught his shoulder. Pain flared, but he managed to raise his foot and kick the attacker back into the snow. The second figure appeared, a shorter, wiry man with pale eyes and a tattoo crawling up his neck. He lunged forward, fists clenched. But that was the moment Hope launched herself from the truck bed. The German shepherd landed on the taller man first, teeth bared, jaws locking onto his forearm. He screamed, trying to shake her off, but she held fast, her body moving with practiced aggression. Not wild, trained. The second man raised his arm to strike her, but Daniel had already drawn his weapon. "Drop it!" he barked. The man froze. For a heartbeat, the mountain was filled only with ragged breaths, falling snow, and the deep, warning growl coming from Hope. Both attackers took a slow step back. Hope stayed between them and Daniel, hackles raised, her muzzle red. Daniel didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the air. That did it. The men fled back to their vehicle and tore off down the trail they'd come from, leaving muddy tracks behind. Daniel dropped to his knees beside Hope. "You saved my life." Hope's tail gave a soft wag. She whimpered and licked at the blood trickling down Daniel's temple. He looked at her differently now. She wasn't just a survivor. She'd fought like a trained protector, like a canine. The precision in her lunge, the way she had positioned herself, he had seen that before, years ago on patrol. Later that afternoon, after cleaning his wound at home and sending the incident footage to Claire, Daniel received an unexpected visitor. Mr. Whitaker shuffled up the porch steps carrying a dented old briefcase and 2 steaming thermoses of cocoa. His wiry frame was bundled in a brown parka, and his white beard danced in the wind like brittle cotton. "I heard gunshots echo up the ridge," he said gruffly, handing Daniel a cup. "You okay, son?" "Got ambushed," Daniel replied, his arm wrapped in gauze. "Hope saved me." Mr. Whitaker nodded solemnly, then tapped the briefcase. "I think it's time I tell you something." They moved inside, where the pups were still dozing in their bedding and Hope curled protectively around them. Whitaker sat on the wooden rocking chair by the fireplace, sipping cocoa. "Back in the 80s, I worked undercover for the Interstate Animal Trafficking Unit. We were tracing a network that stretched from New Mexico to Wyoming. Fought hard to shut it down, but it scattered into smaller cells." He opened the briefcase, revealing yellowed folders, Polaroids, and case notes. "I thought the trail had gone cold, until I saw that warehouse you filmed." Daniel leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You recognize it?" "Not the location," Whitaker said, "but the methods. Look here, these crate markings, tag numbers. They're similar. Some of these names match the aliases our targets used back then, and we always suspected they used canine dogs either stolen from departments or recruited from retired stock." Daniel's stomach dropped. "You think Hope might have been one of them?" Whitaker studied the dog. Her reaction today wasn't just maternal instinct. That was tactical defense. Someone trained her. Maybe she was taken from her handler. Maybe they tried to use her for fighting or breeding, but she resisted. Daniel looked at Hope again this time, not just with affection, but awe. "Then she's not just a victim, she's a witness." Whitaker nodded. "And maybe the key." Before leaving, Whitaker handed over copies of old warrants, suspect sketches, and a map dotted with abandoned transport hubs. "FBI will want this," he said quietly. That night, Claire came by with updates. She had shoulder-length blonde hair, usually tied back in a ponytail, and wore her standard fleece patrol jacket over jeans. She was quick-witted, fiercely loyal, and one of the few people Daniel trusted completely. "The Bureau's sending someone out tomorrow. They saw your footage, said it's the break they've been waiting for." Daniel exhaled, relieved. Claire walked over to Hope and crouched, stroking her head gently. "You're something else, girl." Hope licked her hand and returned to her pups. As the fire cracked and the mountain wind howled outside, Daniel sat with the others and reviewed the files Whitaker had brought. Each page was another piece of the puzzle. Each document proof that the storm wasn't over, it was just circling back. But now he wasn't alone. He had hope. And the snare was tightening. The dawn broke over Pine Hollow with an unusual stillness, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Frost sparkled on the pine branches, and the distant sound of engines echoed from the ridge. Daniel stood in the yard, coat zipped high, watching as a convoy of unmarked black SUVs wove its way through the wooded trail toward his cabin. The moment had come. Hope sat beside him, no leash needed. She stood poised, ears slightly back, one eye watching the road, the other flicking toward her pups who were nestled in a padded crate near the porch. Her posture was noble, like a general awaiting allies. The lead vehicle pulled up and outstepped Special Agent Mia Morales, a woman in her early 40s with olive skin, short-cropped dark hair, and a trench coat that moved with purpose. She was tall, sharp-eyed, and carried herself with the calm intensity of someone who had spent decades chasing monsters that lurked in daylight. Behind her, two younger agents flanked her silently: Agent Lopez, lanky and clean-shaven, and Agent Brody, stocky with a buzz cut and a faint southern drawl. "You're Daniel Hayes?" Morales extended her hand firmly. "I am," Daniel replied, shaking it. "And this must be Hope." Morales crouched slightly, letting the German Shepherd sniff her hand. Hope wagged her tail, once reserved but accepting. "We've heard a lot about you, girl." They moved quickly. The plan was to raid the abandoned warehouse before noon. Claire arrived in her patrol SUV, wearing tactical gear and her auburn ponytail tucked under a black cap. Her presence eased Daniel's nerves. Together, they reviewed the layout, entry points, and Whitaker's maps. The old man stayed back at the cabin, nursing arthritis and sorting through more documents, but his earlier intelligence had helped fill critical gaps. The warehouse wasn't just a holding site, it was a distribution hub. A junction in a much larger pipeline stretching across 4 states. Morales led the briefing. "We'll go in silent, no sirens. We want them unaware. Animal control units are on standby nearby. If what you say is true, there may be dozens of dogs inside." The operation began before the sun climbed over the mountain tops. The team moved like shadows. SUVs parked a quarter-mile out. Agents slipped through the trees. Daniel stayed with Claire, Hope beside them, her body tense with memory. She knew this place. She had smelled these walls, feared these footsteps. As they neared the warehouse, muffled sounds emerged. Metal clinks, low growls, human voices. The building was a patchwork of rusted tin and tarps, barely upright, but inside the horror was intact. Morales gave the signal. Doors burst open. Chaos erupted, but only for a moment. The handlers inside were too slow, too surprised. One tried to flee but was tackled by Agent Brody. Another shouted, but Claire shoved him to the ground, cuffs snapping into place. Dogs barked, whined, scrambled. Daniel and Hope entered last. The sight made his stomach twist. Cages, dozens of them. Some stacked, some broken. Inside, animals in varying states of trauma, eyes wide, ribs visible, fur matted. And amidst them, the unmistakable presence of working dogs. German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, even a Labrador with a scarred muzzle and faded police vest. Some wore rusted tags. Others bore chipped ears and surgical tattoos. Hope moved swiftly past the cages, sniffing. She stopped at one inside was a shepherd barely older than her, thin but regal. Their noses touched through the bars. A low, mournful whine echoed between them. Morales stepped forward. "We'll get them out. All of them." By sunset, the town buzzed with a mix of shock and triumph. News crews arrived. Claire gave a brief statement, flanked by Morales and Daniel. Hope stood beside them, her image captured by every lens. Reporters called her the survivor, the key witness, the miracle mother. Claire's voice rang through the microphones. Today's victory is thanks to the courage of one dog and the man who chose to listen to her story. Pine Hollow is no longer silent. In the following days, the town transformed. Volunteers gathered. A temporary shelter was built on the fairgrounds, a makeshift sanctuary filled with hay beds, heat lamps, and kindness. Children painted signs with phrases like, "You are loved," and "Heroes have 4 legs." Daniel and Claire worked side by side organizing food drives and medication drop-offs. Claire's ability to coordinate under pressure, her sharp tongue balanced with fierce empathy, won her the affection of both townsfolk and the FBI. She and Daniel shared quiet looks, now and smiles over coffee, lingering hands when brushing past crates. Something deeper was growing, though neither spoke of it yet. Hope and her pups were given a special enclosure near the shelter's entrance. People lined up just to see her. Children drew pictures of her with capes and medals. One little girl left a hand-drawn card that read, "Thank you for saving the forgotten voices." And yet, through all the celebration, Daniel remained grounded. One evening, he sat with Mr. Whitaker on the porch. The old man wore his wool cap low and sipped from a chipped mug. "You did good, son," Whitaker said, tapping his cane. "This town's been hollow for a long time. You filled something we forgot was even missing." Daniel looked at Hope sleeping beside her pups. "I didn't fill it. She did." Whitaker nodded. "Sometimes it takes a soul that's suffered to awaken others." Later that night, Daniel knelt beside Hope and whispered, "They finally see you now. You brought light into a place that forgot how to hope." Hope opened one eye and gave a quiet sigh. Her pups nestled against her belly, safe. The past would never be erased, but it no longer had the final word. The town of Pine Hollow had begun to heal, and it all started with a mother who refused to be silent. The last of the snow melted slowly, like a curtain lifting from a long, haunted performance. Pine Hollow emerged into spring not just with blooming crocuses and longer days, but with a new heartbeat, steady, warm, and full of purpose. Daniel stood on the front porch of his cabin, coffee mug in hand, watching the sunrise stretch across the clearing. Hope lay at his feet, her ears flicking gently with the breeze. Her 5 pups, now rambunctious furballs, tumbled over one another in the wet grass, yipping and growling with mock ferocity. The cabin, once dim and silent, had changed. Daniel had taken down the thick curtains. Light now streamed freely through the windows. Walls that had borne the weight of memory were freshly painted, adorned with framed photos of the rescue, of Hope and the pups, of Claire laughing beside them in muddy boots. Claire had become a near-daily visitor. Most mornings she arrived in her off-duty jeans and plaid shirts, sometimes with a toolbox, sometimes with bags of supplies. Her hair, no longer tightly bound in a tactical ponytail, now flowed freely with a softness Daniel hadn't seen before. One afternoon, while hammering a fence post into the ground, Claire wiped sweat from her brow and grinned. "You know," she said, "I think this place is missing a name." Daniel glanced up. "What kind of name?" She stood, hands on her hips, surveying the land. "Something that says it's more than your home now. Something like Shepherd's Haven." Hope, as if sensing the importance of the moment, let out a low, approving bark. And so it began. The idea had grown like wildflowers. What started as a nickname became a mission. Daniel and Claire, with Hope at their side, began converting the property into a sanctuary for abandoned and rescued animals. Kennels were built. A training yard was cleared. A small wooden sign, carved by a local artisan named Elias Monroe, was placed near the road. Elias, a white-haired woodworker in his 70s with calloused hands and a quiet, reverent nature, had etched each letter by hand. Shepherd's Haven, the sign read, where second chances find their pause. News of the project spread quickly. Volunteers came from town and beyond. Some brought old crates and food donations. Others offered veterinary services, building materials, or simply time. Teenagers painted murals on the outer walls, bright depictions of dogs leaping over meadows, a smiling hope leading a pack beneath a golden sun. But the most unexpected gift came from Mr. Whitaker. One morning, he knocked on Daniel's door, bundled in his usual wool coat and carrying a rolled-up parchment in his gloved hands. His face, lined with years of both sorrow and wisdom, looked unusually determined. "I want to give you something," he said simply. He unrolled a land deed, an official document declaring a donation of 5 acres of adjacent woodland. "This land belonged to my late wife's family," he explained. "She always wanted to see it used for something good, something lasting." Daniel's voice caught in his throat. "Are you sure?" Whitaker looked out toward Hope, now lying in the grass beside her growing pups. "I've seen enough bad things in this world, son. It's time I help grow something good." The donated land became an extension of the Haven walking paths, quiet recovery zones, even a memorial garden for the dogs who didn't make it. Claire helped plant wildflowers along the path. Daniel built benches beneath the old oak trees. Hope's role shifted naturally. She became a matriarch, not just to her pups, but to every new arrival. Whenever a frightened dog came in, trembling and unsure, Hope would approach with careful, motherly grace. She'd sniff gently, nudge softly, and wait patiently until they calmed. Her presence was steadying, reassuring. The town now spoke of her not as a victim, but as a guardian. Kids visiting the shelter called her Queen Hope. Seniors brought blankets they'd knitted just for her pups. Local law enforcement officers dropped by to check on the dogs they once thought were lost forever. One of the most moving arrivals was a dog named Bruno, a thick-set black Labrador with a broken leg and cloudy eyes. He had once been a firehouse dog in a different state, displaced during a storm and presumed dead. When he arrived at the shelter, growling and distrustful, Hope was the only one he allowed near. Within days, he began following her like a shadow. Claire often joked, "You've built a kingdom, Daniel, and she's your ruling queen." Daniel would laugh, but deep down he knew it was true. One warm afternoon, while planting marigolds along the fence, Daniel looked over to see Claire standing near the porch. In her hands was a soft leather collar. It was engraved with a single word: Guardian. "She deserves it," she said, slipping the collar gently around Hope's neck. The shepherd looked up, tail wagging once in solemn understanding. That evening, the Haven hosted its first community gathering. Tables were laid out with food and lemonade. A bluegrass trio played from the porch steps. Children ran through the field, pups chasing after them. Hope, now graying around the muzzle, stood at the center, surrounded by laughter, love, and life. Daniel took a quiet moment, stepping back from the crowd. He gazed at the flickering lanterns, the joy radiating from every corner of the field, and felt something lift from his chest. He thought of his late wife, of her dream to help animals, of the quiet days when the cabin had echoed with silence. And now it echoed with barking and joy. The past would always be part of him, but it no longer ruled him. Hope brushed against his leg, her gaze soft and loyal. He leaned down, forehead against hers. "Thank you," he whispered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Pine Hollow glowed not just from lanterns, but from hearts rekindled. And in the center of it all, a dog named Hope had proven what no one expected: that light, once lost, could find its way home again. Sometimes God sends us angels not with wings, but with paws, scars, and eyes that have seen too much, yet still choose to love. Hope wasn't just a dog. She was a survivor, a protector, a guide sent at the exact moment when darkness seemed too heavy to bear. Through her, Daniel found purpose again. A town found unity, and dozens of lost souls found shelter and love. This story reminds us that even the most broken can become the greatest blessing. That what the world throws away, heaven often uses for miracles. In your life, you may feel abandoned, forgotten, or wounded, but just like Hope, your scars might become someone else's salvation. So if you believe in second chances, in divine timing, in the quiet power of animals to heal what humans cannot. Then let this story stay with you. Share this video with someone who needs a little light. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. If this story touched your heart, type Amen in the comments and say a prayer for all the animals still waiting to be saved. And don't forget to subscribe, because there's more hope-filled stories waiting to be told. May God bless every heart that watches this, and may you never forget, sometimes a miracle walks on 4 legs.